Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video.
Story 1. The Last Breath. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Waverly. The kind of evening where everything felt still and almost too perfect. The air was cool and crisp, and the scent of fresh rain lingered in the air. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves being blown across the street, a whispering wind that seemed to carry a secret. But for Alice, it wasn't just another ordinary evening. It was the night everything would change. Alice had lived in Waverly her entire life. She knew the town like the back of her hand, from the ancient oak tree by the lake to the creaky old house at the end of Willow Street. She had seen the town grow, seen families move in and out, but there was one house that had always remained the same. The old house on the hill, the one everyone whispered about. The house had stood abandoned for as long as Alice could remember, and most people avoided it. No one knew who had lived there or why it had been left to rot in the first place. But Alice was different. She had always been drawn to the house, its peeling paint, the broken windows, and the strange, persistent feeling that someone or something was still there. It was the strange stories she'd heard as a child that kept her intrigued. People said the house was haunted, that it was cursed. There were whispers of a woman, pale and thin, who had once lived there. Some said she had died in the house, while others claimed she had disappeared without a trace. The common story, however, was always the same. Before she vanished, she had whispered something to the townspeople, her last words barely audible. "It's not over." Alice hadn't thought much about the stories in years, but as she stood outside the house that night, something stirred in her, a mix of curiosity and unease. She had promised herself she'd never go near it, but tonight felt different. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the hill, and she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was the night she had to find out the truth. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest, the gravel crunching under her feet as she approached the rusted iron gate. The wind seemed to pick up around her, and the trees whispered secrets she couldn't understand. Alice hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the gate, which groaned in protest. She was standing at the front door of the old house now, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. The door, half open, creaked like it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the once grand staircase rose before her, its banister worn and broken in places. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped further into the house, the shadows stretching long and unnerving in the dim light. Alice took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway, the silence around her suffocating. Suddenly, she heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper, like a breath caught in the wind. She froze, her eyes wide, searching the darkness around her. "It's not over." Alice's blood ran cold as the words echoed in her mind, and for a moment, she thought she might turn and run. But something kept her rooted to the spot, something deeper, something she couldn't explain. She had to know what had happened here, why the house had been left abandoned all these years. She had to know the truth. Following the whisper, She moved down the hallway toward a door at the far end. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she was hit by a cold draft, a stark contrast to the warmth of the night outside. The room was dark, but something glimmered in the corner of her eye. Alice stepped inside, her heart racing. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its glass cracked, the reflection distorted and eerie. But it wasn't the mirror that caught her attention. It was the figure standing in front of it. A woman, pale and thin, her hair long and tangled, stood with her back to Alice. She didn't move, didn't seem to notice Alice's presence at all. Her head hung low, her body almost unnaturally still. But Alice felt a pull, a strange compulsion to step closer. As she did, the woman's head lifted, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Empty, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. Alice gasped, stepping back in terror, but the woman didn't move. Instead, she whispered again, her voice soft but chilling. "It's not over. You're here now." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Alice felt a chill that sank into her bones. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if something had shifted in the house, something ancient and forgotten. The woman's lips barely moved as she spoke again. "You've awakened it." Alice's mind raced, panic rising in her chest. She had heard stories about spirits haunting the house, about the curse, but she hadn't believed it. Not really. But now, standing in front of this ghostly figure, her rational mind crumbled. "What do you want?" Alice whispered, her voice trembling. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, though it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I want to be remembered," she said. "I want the last breath of this house to be heard. It's time for you to listen." Alice didn't understand what the woman meant. She didn't know what she was supposed to hear or why she was even here. But she knew, in that moment, that the house had a secret, one that had been buried for years, waiting for the right person to uncover it. The woman's form began to blur, fading into the shadows, and Alice's body froze as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You're the last one. You're the last breath." With a sudden, violent force, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping Alice inside. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The whispers swirled around her, a cacophony of voices, some familiar, some foreign. And as the darkness closed in, Alice understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was waiting for her to become its final breath, to take its place in the forgotten history of Eldergrove. As the last breath of the house echoed in her ears, Alice felt herself drawn into the darkness, lost forever in the whispers that would never be silenced. And the house stood still, waiting for the next person to hear its story, waiting for the next soul to enter its walls. It was never over. Not for Alice. Not for anyone. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. As Alice's vision blurred, the shadows closing in around her, she felt herself being pulled into the darkness, unable to resist the weight of it. The whispers grew louder, their words a chaotic blend of voices from every corner of the house. She could no longer tell which voices were hers, which belonged to the woman, or which were the spirits that had once lived in the house. It all became one, a hum of anguish, longing, and something darker, more primal. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, the wood groaning in protest. Alice stumbled, her body unable to keep up with the pull that tugged her deeper into the house. She felt her feet leave the ground for a moment, as if the very house were lifting her, pulling her closer to the center of the darkness. It was no longer a house, it was a force, a living thing that existed to consume. Her breath quickened, panic rising in her chest, but there was nowhere to run. The room began to twist, the walls contorting into unnatural angles. The once familiar hallway stretched out before her, now a labyrinth of endless corridors. She tried to scream again, but no sound escaped her lips. The woman's voice returned, clearer now, cutting through the chaos. You are the last. You are the one who will finish what was started. Alice's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the words. She was the last of what? The last of the people who had entered this cursed house? The last of the family that had lived here? The last to uncover its secrets? Or perhaps the last to fall victim to its endless hunger? Her mind swam with confusion, and the shadows seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her. She could feel the cold breath of something unseen on her skin, and she knew, deep down, that it was the house itself. The entity that had once been a home, now twisted and broken, feeding off the souls that entered it. The woman appeared before her again, her face now gaunt and hollow, the skin stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes, empty voids, stared at Alice with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. You didn't listen, the woman whispered. You didn't understand. It's too late now. Alice's breath hitched as the woman's form began to dissolve, her body breaking apart into a cloud of dust, scattering around the room like remnants of something long forgotten. The last thing Alice saw was the woman's eyes, those dark, empty eyes, watching her as if they had always known this moment would come. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers faded, the shadows retreated, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Alice was no longer floating, no longer trapped in the shifting walls of the house. She found herself standing in the center of the room, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She was still in the house, but it was different now. The air felt heavier, charged with an oppressive presence, and the house itself seemed to be watching her, waiting for her next move. Alice knew she had to leave, had to escape before it was too late. She turned to run, but the door she had entered through was gone. In its place stood a wall, solid and impenetrable. Desperation clawed at Alice's throat as she backed away, her mind racing. What was happening? Why couldn't she leave? Her eyes flicked to the mirror once more, and she froze. In the reflection, she saw herself, but it wasn't the Alice she knew. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, her mouth twisted into a twisted smile that didn't belong to her. The reflection of her body seemed to shift, as if it were no longer completely hers. She reached out to touch the glass, but the reflection did not follow her movements. The figure in the mirror, her own reflection, reached out first. Alice's scream caught in her throat as the reflection's hand pressed against the glass. The cold, glassy surface of the mirror beginning to ripple like water. A dark, clawed hand reached through the surface, its fingers long and jagged, its skin rotting and decayed. "No!" Alice cried, stumbling back, but the hand from the mirror reached further, its claws sinking into the walls of the room, pulling itself through, inch by inch. The house groaned around her, the very walls seeming to breathe with hunger. The shadow from the mirror, her shadow, came closer, stepping out of the reflection and into the room. It was no longer a simple reflection. It was something else, something dark, something hungry, and it was coming for her. Alice backed away, heart racing, her mind screaming for escape. But there was no escape. The house had already claimed her. As the shadow reached out to grab her, the floor beneath Alice gave way. She fell, tumbling into a dark abyss, the sound of her fall muffled by the ever-present whispers that now filled her ears. "It's too late." The voice seemed to echo through her very soul as she plummeted into darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black were the woman's hollow eyes, staring at her from the shadows. The house stood still, silent once more, but the whispers never ceased. They would continue, forever echoing within its walls, waiting for the next soul to wander in, to become the last breath. And the darkness would always be there, waiting. Story 2. The Silent Room. The house on Elm Street had always been one of the oldest in town, its wooden frame creaking in the wind and its windows coated with years of dust and grime. But among the townspeople, there was one room that no one spoke of, the room at the far end of the hallway, where the air always seemed to grow unnaturally still. The room was silent, in a way that unsettled the very essence of the house itself. For years it had been locked, the key lost to time, and yet everyone knew its existence. The room wasn't part of any floor plan. It seemed to defy the natural structure of the house. But it was there, at the end of the hallway, its door always shut, as if it was waiting for something or someone. Alice had heard the stories as a child, how the room was a place of sorrow, how it had once been a study for the house's original owner, a man known only as Mr. Hargrave. People whispered that he had never left, that his presence still lingered, trapped in that room, suffocating under its heavy silence. But Alice had grown up with the house, and the mysteries of it had faded in the haze of time. The room was simply there, out of sight, out of mind, until the day her parents decided to renovate. They had moved into the house only a few months ago. Alice and her younger brother, Thomas, were still adjusting to their new life in this quiet town, but the house had felt like home. That is, until the renovations began. One evening, as her father was tinkering with the old staircase, the workmen discovered something odd. An extra room behind the wall that separated the hallway from the attic. The walls were strangely thick, and when they knocked through them, they uncovered a small, narrow doorway leading to the silent room. The door had been sealed with layers of paint and plaster, but it was still intact. And, most disturbingly, it had never been on any of the house's original blueprints. "We should leave it alone," one of the workers had said, a look of unease crossing his face. Some things should stay hidden, but Alice's father, ever the skeptic, decided that they would open it. After all, the house had secrets. Didn't all old houses? Maybe there was a hidden treasure, a forgotten relic from the past, waiting to be found. As the door creaked open, The house seemed to shudder, as if a breath had been held for far too long and finally released. The air in the room was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in a dark, sticky substance that Alice couldn't quite identify. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces blurred by time, as if the people in them were trying to escape. But the strangest thing was the silence, utter and complete. It was as if no sound had ever touched this place, as if time itself had frozen the moment the door was closed. And then there was the smell. It wasn't musty like the rest of the house, nor was it the scent of decaying wood. It was something much darker, something far more unsettling. It smelled of something ancient, of something long forgotten. It smelled like loss. Alice's father stepped inside, waving his hand through the air as if to dispel the heavy silence. "Nothing special here," he muttered. "Just an old room. We'll clean it up and turn it into another storage space." But as he turned to leave, Alice felt it. A presence. A cold, unsettling feeling that wrapped around her like a cloak, pressing against her skin. It was as though something was watching her, something invisible, lurking in the shadows. Her heart began to pound, and she felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But Thomas was already inside the room, his small fingers trailing along the faded wallpaper. "Look, Alice," he called out, his voice filled with wonder. "There's something in the corner." Alice turned to see what he was pointing to, her throat tightening. In the farthest corner of the room, partially hidden by a thick curtain of cobwebs, was an old rocking chair. It sat perfectly still, but the longer Alice stared at it, the more she felt as though it was moving, just a little, as if someone or something was sitting in it. "Thomas, get away from there," Alice warned, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't touch it." But Thomas was already closer, his fingers brushing the back of the chair. And that's when it happened. The door slammed shut behind them. Alice whipped around, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of wood that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Panic surged through her, and she reached for the door, but there was no handle, no way to open it. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice trembling. "Dad, help!" But the silence remained unbroken. No footsteps, no reply, just the sound of her own breathing, ragged and frantic. She turned back to Thomas, who was now staring at something on the floor, his face pale. In the center of the room was a strange symbol, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. The floor around it was cracked, as if something had been buried there. Something heavy, something long forgotten. Alice felt the temperature drop, and she shivered as a cold wind rushed through the room, despite there being no open windows. The symbol seemed to pulse, its edges flickering like a dying flame. Suddenly, she heard it, the faint sound of a whisper. It was so quiet at first, she thought she might be imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. "Leave." Alice spun around, her heart thundering in her chest. The voice had come from behind her, from the rocking chair. She hesitated, her body frozen in place, before she dared to look. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it now, a man, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes glowed faintly, as if lit from within, and his mouth twisted into a grin that was not kind. "Leave now," he whispered again, his voice as cold as the silence that surrounded them. Before Alice could react, the room began to spin, the walls warping and bending around her. The temperature plummeted even further, and the ground beneath her feet felt as though it were shifting, pulling her deeper into the earth. She screamed as the darkness consumed her, But the silent room, remained still, unmoving, as if nothing had ever happened. The next morning, the room was empty once more. No sign of Alice, no sign of Thomas, just the rocking chair, still and silent in the corner, its empty seat waiting. And as the days passed, the house on Elm Street fell silent again. But now there was something more, something even darker. The silence had deepened, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. The house had claimed its new residence, and the silent room waited for the next to enter. But no one dared to go near it again. The house had found its peace. For now, days turned into weeks, and the house on Elm Street, once full of life, now stood eerily quiet. The townspeople began to forget the families who had lived there, their names fading like whispers in the wind. Some even forgot about the room at the end of the hallway, the silent room. But those who had lived nearby and dared to remember knew that the house was not truly empty. The room still waited. It was just after dawn when Linda, a young woman who had recently moved to the town, heard the stories about the house. She had come to Elm Street seeking peace after the turmoil of city life. With a fresh start ahead of her, she had rented a small house just a few streets over, unaware of the history that lingered in the shadows of Elm Street. But it wasn't long before the tales started to reach her. Linda had always been the curious type, the kind who needed to understand everything, no matter how strange. She spent her days exploring the town, meeting new people, and hearing bits and pieces of the strange happenings surrounding the house on Elm Street. The place is cursed. An elderly woman named Mrs. Doyle had told her one afternoon while Linda was picking up groceries. No one goes near it. The silent room, they say, takes people who stay too long. Linda's curiosity was piqued. Why do they call it the silent room? She had asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the very name of the room carried some unspoken power. Mrs. Doyle had looked at her for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, before she leaned closer. Because whatever happens in there, it never makes a sound. Not a single one. You'll go in, but you won't come back out the same. No one ever does. Linda had laughed it off at first, dismissing the warnings as superstition. But the stories kept coming. Each conversation, each encounter with the townsfolk, seemed to reinforce the same eerie warning. The house was more than just a building. It was a place where the past was trapped, and where the darkness from long ago still clung to the walls. One evening, after hearing one too many tales, Linda found herself walking down Elm Street. The house stood at the far end, dark and looming. The windows stared back at her, vacant and empty, as if daring her to approach. She had to see it for herself. Linda's steps echoed down the sidewalk as she approached the house, her heart quickening in her chest. The door to the house was locked, but the gate to the yard was open, and she slipped inside. The ground was covered with dried leaves, their crisp edges rustling in the wind. She made her way to the side of the house, where the small window to the basement was slightly ajar. The house felt wrong. Every step she took made the air feel denser, heavier. She felt as though she were walking through a fog that only she could see. But her curiosity pressed her forward. She had to know. Linda reached the back door, which creaked as she gently nudged it open. It was strange how easy it was to get inside. She expected the door to be locked, like all the others, but it opened as though it had been waiting for her. Her pulse quickened, but she couldn't stop now. She stepped inside. The house was cold, much colder than the outside air. The silence was deafening. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. The hallway stretched before her, dark and narrow. At the end of the hall, the door to the silent room stood, slightly ajar, its weathered frame untouched by time. Linda's heart skipped a beat as she approached it. There was something drawing her in, something she couldn't ignore. She reached for the door and pushed it open, her breath shallow. Inside, the room was dim, the only light coming from a small crack in the wall. Dust motes floated in the stale air, dancing in the slivers of light. And then she heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like the faintest whisper. It came from the far corner, where the rocking chair stood, still and unmoving. Linda froze, every muscle in her body tense. The room was still, too still, but the chair, it had moved, just a little. Her gaze locked on the chair, her heart racing. The figure that had sat there before wasn't visible now, but Linda could feel its presence. Something in the room was watching her, waiting. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaky. The silence answered. Her breath quickened, and she turned to leave, but the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. Linda spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on her. A cold gust of wind swirled through the room, and she heard it again, the faintest whisper. "Leave." Linda's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, as if it were alive, as if the house itself were closing in around her. She tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The rocking chair moved again. This time, it wasn't just a slight motion. It was as if something was sitting in it, something that wasn't human. The chair creaked and swayed as if an invisible force were rocking it back and forth. Linda's pulse surged, and in that moment, she knew she wasn't alone. She wasn't alone in this room, in this house. She never had been. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Let me out." But the house wasn't listening. It had no intention of letting her go. It wanted her just as it had wanted the others. Suddenly, the room went completely dark. Linda could hear nothing but the pounding of her heart in her ears. She fumbled for the door again, her hands trembling, but the darkness was suffocating. The whispering came louder now, filling her ears, her thoughts. Leave or stay forever. And then something touched her, something cold and clammy, like the brush of fingers across her skin. She gasped, her breath hitching in her throat. But when she turned, there was nothing there. The room swirled before her eyes, and before she could grasp what was happening, the door to the silent room flew open. She stumbled out, gasping for air, and collapsed on the floor of the hallway, her body trembling from head to toe. The house was silent again, but Linda knew she had barely escaped. The silent room would always be there, waiting for someone else to enter, waiting to claim whoever dared disturb it. As Linda stood up and ran out of the house, she looked back one last time, a shiver running down her spine. The house stood there, as silent and still as ever, but she knew the truth now. The silent room wasn't just a room. It was a prison, and it would never be empty again.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.